I know. Shut this down.
Good evening, everybody. I apologize for some of the technical difficulties here. Zoom did an upgrade recently, and this is the first Zoom class I've given since the upgrade. So I'm still learning my way around the new upgrades. But thank you all for coming. It is so great to be back. We had a very nice family trip, and we all know the difference between a trip and a vacation. And this was definitely a trip by all measures. And it was a great time nonetheless, but it is a pleasure to really be back here with all of you, teaching a little bit of Jewish history. And now let's just rock and roll because we're getting a few minutes late start and jump right in where we left off. I think it was 3 weeks ago now at this point. So for those of you who remember, or for those of you who took the time to review the class from 3 weeks ago before coming in today, or for just even if you don't know, I'll let you know we were in the middle of talking about King David. And in the last session we had together, we talked all about the tumultuous life of King David, the ups and the downs, and how that really painted the picture that made him very much who he was, and not only who he was, but made him the quintessential king of the Jewish people, so much so that we have the concept of David Melech Yisrael Chai V'Kayam, that King David will live forever. No, that does not mean literally King David living forever, because he only lived for 70 years. But it does mean that the house of David will endure forever, that it'll be the house of David, which will be the house of kingship, the messianic house of the Jewish people. And whenever we talk about that term Messiah, as we explained last time, we've explained numerous times before, all it is an anglicized version of the Hebrew word Mashiach, which means anointed, because David was the king, and any king is called the anointed one. And when we talk about David's kingdom enduring forever, and we talk about the coming of Messiah, we're talking about the reinstitution of the Davidic line, of the king of Israel descending from David, and specifically David through Shlomo. Tonight, we're going to talk about the passing of David and the passing of the torch on to his son Shlomo. And we attribute the house to the house of David, but Shlomo as his son, we're going to see, at least in the early days of his career, basically finishes up some of the major projects that David started in his life. And as we paint the picture of the house of David, and at least the beginning of the house of Shlomo, we'll come to understand the concept really of Messiah, which is really understanding the king of Israel, what the king is supposed to be, what it's supposed to look like, and therefore ultimately what we are anticipating when we talk about the Messianic era, when we talk about the Jewish waiting and yearning for the coming of Mashiach, for the coming of the Messiah. As we're saying here, the reinstitution of the monarchy in Israel, the Davidic monarchy. Because as I often point out, we are some of the luckiest Jews in more than 2 millennia, because we're the first Jews since the destruction of the first temple to see the majority of the world Jewish population living in Israel. But one thing we always have to remember, and in as much as far as we've gotten, we've returned to the land of Israel, we've rebuilt the land of Israel in many ways. We have I'll call it a imperfect sovereignty in the land of Israel, because while Baruch Hashem, we are sovereign over there, it is challenged daily, as Rabbi Daniel Gordis often points out. A great line that I quote often is that we talk about the different wars in the modern day state of Israel, and they're not different wars. They're all just the most recent battle in the War of Independence, because the War of Independence has been going on for 75 years, because the belligerents in the war have not ended the war. They've had ceasefires, they've had temporary ceasefires, they've been essentially in a state of war with many of the neighbors of the land of Israel for 75 years. So this is by far not what we're talking about when we talk about the Messianic era. Hopefully it's the beginning of it. Hopefully it'll lead to it, but it's definitely not there yet. And when we're talking about what we talk about, our topic for tonight, we will have a innate understanding of what the picture looks like that we are in fact anticipating. Okay, so for those of you who are joining us a little late, I'm going to put once again the link in the chat box for the outline if you'd like to follow. I don't know if you can re-access the previous chats when you come in late, so we'll just put it there to be safe. And we are going to delve right into that outline. Okay. So towards the end of David's life, it's tumultuous all along, tumultuous from the beginning, tumultuous in the middle, tumultuous in the end. But we learn so much from David because with every tumultuous activity, with every moment of difficulty, his response is always the same. First of all, he never denies wrongdoing. He always says the words, I think it's quoted 3 times in the book of Samuel, chatasi. I sinned, I transgressed. When he is caught on things, he says, I did wrong, and he tries to grow from that. And that's what we saw when we talked about Bathsheba, the incident with Bathsheba. And that's what we see through all of the transgressions that he does. And that is part of how the picture is painted of him being the king of the Jewish people. Now, towards the end of David's life, as it's clear that his days are coming to an end, as he's not well, one of his sons by the name of Adoniah or Adonyahu proclaims that he is the king of Israel. In other words, he will be the successor of his father, King David. Now, who was Adoniah or Adonyahu? By the way, in Hebrew, every time you have a name that ends in a yud and a hey, it can be just Adoniah like this, or Adonyahu, like Eliyahu, Elia, same name. Elisha, Elishiyahu, sorry, not Elisha. Yeshaya, Yeshayahu, Yirmiyahu. That's a across the board in Hebrew. So Adoniah is one example of that. So we see with Adoniah that he claims the throne of Israel. He says he's going to be king of Israel. Now, what is his claim? That he is going to be the successor to King David? Well, quite simply, he is the oldest son who is still around. We are told, as we talked about last time, that some of the oldest sons of King David did not have a very happy demise. First of all, we had Amnon, who was killed by his brother Avshalom. We had that was the first son. We had Avshalom, who was the second son, who led a rebellion against his father David. Then we have something named Chilav, who had either passed away at this point or was just totally not interested in being king. And then Adoniah was the fourth son. So he figured, I'm the next in line. I'm the oldest one who's in the running still. I should be king. And he proclaims himself king over Israel. He says that he will be the one to succeed David as king of Israel after his passing. Now, this ruffles the feathers of 2 very significant people. One is David's wife, Bathsheba, and the other is the prophet Nathan. Now, why is that? Because first of all, we're told that David had made a promise to Bathsheba, to his wife Bathsheba, that her son would be the successor to the throne. Her son Shlomo, her son Solomon would be the successor to the throne. So out of his 18 wives and his numerous children, he had promised Bathsheba that her son, in fact, would inherit. And we, again, if you want more on that, we really talked about it last time. We went into the lineage and the questions and the question marks on the messianic line, but the line had to go through Bathsheba. She knew it through her extra set of understanding that women have far above men. And if that wasn't good enough, she had the prophet on her side. And that's where Nathan the prophet comes in. Nathan the prophet backs up Bathsheba that what Adoniah was doing was not correct. And they both approach King David. They say, Adoniah cannot be the successor. It is supposed to be Shlomo. We have to do something, because if something is not done before you pass away, there could be problems over here. So what King David and Bathsheba and the prophet Nathan do is they hold an anointing ceremony. Now, technically, there wasn't, it's actually a big discussion in the Talmud if when a father succeeds his son, when a son succeeds his father on the throne, if it is necessary for another anointing to take place. Because we're going to see throughout the book of Kings and throughout the book of Chronicles, sometimes it mentions an anointing and sometimes it doesn't. So the Talmud comes to the conclusion that the only time a king or a son taking over for a father has to be anointed is if the throne is in question. In other words, if it's a disputed throne, that's when anointing is necessary. God has to come back in and intervene. The prophet has to be told what to do, and the prophet has to anoint the king. So Nathan, Bathsheba felt that that was the situation at hand. And sure enough, there's an anointing ceremony of Nathan the prophet for Solomon to be the successor to King David. Now, there's a number of interesting things as we introduce Shlomo HaMelech. First of all, the time that he is anointed, the time he becomes king, he is all of 12 years old. He's a 12-year-old king. And what's even more fascinating is we're going to see that he dies very young. He dies at the age of 52. So he rules for 40 years, 4 of which are extremely successful, 36 of which are not. And that's what we're going to delve into tonight and come to an understanding of. And just as a backdrop for who he is in that division of the 4 years versus the 36 years, whenever we talk about those first 4 years, we refer to Shlomo as Shlomo ben David, as King Solomon, son of King David. Whenever we talk about King Solomon in the latter 36 years, he's just Shlomo HaMelech. He's just King Solomon. And one of the things that the commentaries tell us is that in those first 4 years, he very much went after the ways of David. And in the next 36 years, he didn't so much. What happened? What was going on here? So David passes away. Now, just an interesting side note that the prophet mentions is towards the end of David's life, he takes a census. Now, it's not a census he's not supposed to take, and he's actually punished for it. But a census is taken, and based on what the prophet tells us, there's roughly 5 million Jews at this time. And this is going to be an interesting discussion at this point, but even more interesting when we talk about the Second Temple and the population growth that happens at the end of the Second Temple time period. But at this point, this is I would say one of the high points, at least in for sure in this time period, of the population of 5 million Jews in Israel at this time. David passes away on the 7th day of Sivan, which for us is the 2nd day of Shavuos, and at the ripe young age of 70, and he is buried in what we now call the city of David, and it is clear that Shlomo takes over, that Solomon takes over. So Solomon takes over at the age of 12. Now, and these, before David passes away, after Solomon has been anointed, he gives Solomon a great Musar Shmuz. He gives him a great discourse as to what is going to take to be the king of Israel. And it's recorded for us in the book of Kings, and it's in the end of the book of Samuel. And it's one simple theme. He says, look, the kingship is not easy. Not an easy job, right? As much, with all due respect to Mel Brooks, it is not so good to be the king. Yet, the one guiding force that you need to be a successful king is you must follow the Torah. If you're going to be a king in the way of Moshe and follow the Torah and be that type of king, you'll be fine. You'll have God on your side. You'll have the people on your side. You'll have the prophets on your side. Everything, and the prophets also, the prophets with a PH and the prophets with an F, you'll have it all on your side, and everything will be fine. But if you stray from that Torah, then you could have challenges. Now, here's David talking to his 12-year-old son, not even a bar mitzvah yet. Again, Solomon was not a bar mitzvah when he took over the throne, but he knows that his son is brilliant. He knows his son is very talented, and he knows that there could possibly be issues here with him following the Torah and staying in the ways of the Jewish kings. So to that end, he gives them such a speech. But really, if we look at that speech, and it's beautiful and it's well worth reading inside, we understand but be it as it may, it's spelled out right there. David spells out for Solomon before he passes away what an idealistic king is. So Solomon takes over after his father passes away, 12 years old, and the first project the first course that he takes as king is he aims to build the Beis Hamikdash. He aims to build the temple. Now, we're told that David did everything possible to build the temple. In other words, his life's goal was to build a temple in Jerusalem. But in the end, the Almighty said, no, it's not going to be for you to do. It's going to have to be for the later generations. Now, even though the Almighty stopped David from being the main architect, if you will, of the temple, David didn't take the approach of, oh, it's going to be for my children or future generations. Forget it. You're going to have nothing to do with it. No, David did everything possible that he could do short of building the actual temple to get the project underway. We're told that David collected all the money. We're told that David actually bought the land, the Har HaBais, the Temple Mount, what we call it now, the Mount Moriah, all the different names we have for. We all know what we're talking about. That up until shortly before this point, Jerusalem was one of the last holdouts of the 7 Canaanite nations. It was controlled by the Jebusite people, or the Yevusim in Hebrew, and David partially conquers the city by war and partially purchases the city. And one of the parts that he purchased was Mount Moriah, was the Temple Mount, because he knew prophetically that, or from at least the prophet Nassan, from the prophet God that was around at that point, that was the place where the temple was to be built. Now, what was so special about that place? So we're taught that the stone, if you will, that the temple is built around is called the Even Shisia, the foundation stone, which means at some sort of Kabbalistic level that I don't have a deep understanding of, that's the stone from which the world was created. Now, does that mean that that was the particle that the Big Bang happened from? I don't know exactly, never quite figured it out, but be it as it may, we're told that is the place where the world was created. And we see that our forefathers all visited Mount Moriah. They all brought offerings on Mount Moriah. So there's already a history, so to speak, of the house of David and this place. So David buys the Temple Mount. He raises all the money. He collects all the money. He collects all the supplies that are needed. He even draws up the plans and briefs Solomon on how to build the temple, his 12-year-old son, right? He briefs him on how to build the temple. So David does everything possible to get the project underway. He brings the Aron HaKodesh, the Ark, which until this point had been in Kiryas Yerim, in the city to the west of Jerusalem. And finally, he brings the Ark to the Temple Mount. He brings offerings on the Temple Mount. And one question that often comes up is what is done when the project actually begins by Solomon with the Mishkan. Now, if you remember from previous sessions, the Mishkan was not doing too well at this point. It had been captured, dismantled, rebuilt, but whatever was left of the tabernacle was buried by Solomon in the Temple Mount, meaning underneath the temple. It was buried there. So we understand that that's where the remnants of the Mishkan went. They went underneath the temple, buried out of the way. Now, we're going to talk about that a little bit more at the end with a little bit of the history of the Temple Mount as we're kind of delving into it. But that's what happens to the Mishkan, to the prelude, the portable temple the Jews had before they actually had the temple in Israel. So Solomon begins the project of building the temple in the Jewish year 2928. Finishes it in the year 2935. So David dies in 837. In 833, the temple goes underway, and in 827 is completed. So when we talk about those, it's interesting. When we talk about those first 4 years of good for Solomon, that was before the temple was even finished. It was still working in the prelude to the building of the temple. And then the building process, the 7-year process of building the temple, we're going to see is already part of the 36 not so good years of King Solomon. And we'll explain what happened in a moment. But let's wrap up the building of the temple first. So the temple is finally completed on the 7th day of Tishrei in the year 827 before the Common Era. corresponding to the year 2935 on the Jewish calendar, and it is a magnificent building. It's magnificent physically, it's magnificent spiritually. I always say that that the Temple of Solomon really should have been one of the wonders of the world. It should have, there's the 7 wonders of the world. There should have been 8th wonder. I think the reason that's not is to be one of the wonders of the world is to us to be in existence, and it's not here anymore. But be it as it may, as it's described in whatever archaeology, little archaeology has been found as remnants of it, back up a lot of what the prophet tells us in the Book of Kings. It was truly a magnificent building. People came from all over the world. Gentiles came from all over the world to see the Temple of Solomon. It was regarded as a wonder to see, as a tourist attraction in and of itself. Now, the Talmud tells us something interesting, that on the day of the inauguration, the 7th day of Tishrei, when Solomon came to open up the temple, so to speak, the keys wouldn't work, if you will. In other words, he tried to open the doors of the temple, and the doors wouldn't open. And so he says the words that were recorded in Psalm Susha Arim Rashechem, he said, open up, V'yavo Melech HaKavod, let the King of Honor come through. And the heavenly spheres of the world thought that he was referring to himself. And so he says, Mihu Zeh Melech HaKavod, who is this King of Honor? Hashem is the King of Honor. And that still wasn't enough. And so Solomon, the inauguration wasn't going well. And finally, he invokes the name of his father David and references his father David and references the fact that David was the one who really led the project and made it happen. And then finally the doors open up and they're able to go in and have the inaugural ceremonies for the temple. So again, just backing up that fact that even though Solomon was the one who executed the building of the temple, we do refer to it many times as the Temple of David, even though David never saw it. So you'll see it a lot of times referred to as the Temple of Solomon and also as the Temple of David. In fact, on Sukkot, when the Birkat Hamazon, we add in a special prayer to pray for the temple to be rebuilt. We say, Harachmanu Yakim Lanu es Sukkos David Hanofalas, that the Almighty should speedily rebuild the Sukkah of David that has fallen. And what is the Sukkah of David? That's talking about Solomon's temple. So it is in many ways credited to David. Now, it's interesting that in the inaugural ceremony, it begins on the 7th day of Tishrei, and it goes for 14 days with much fanfare, much party, and banquets and celebrations. Now, what happens in the middle of those 14 days? There are 2 significant Jewish calendar moments in those 14 days after the 7th day of Tishrei. They're both coming up. One is Yom Kippur, right? Yom Kippur is on the 10th day of Tishrei, and the other is the holiday of Sukkot. So yes, in fact, both Sukkot and Yom Kippur happened during this time period of the inauguration of the Beis Hamikdash, of the Holy Temple. And the prophet tells us that this is the one time in history since its inception that Yom Kippur was actually canceled and sanctioned by God. The Yom Kippur was canceled and was due to the celebration of the dedication of the temple in Jerusalem. Now, in many ways, really in just about every way, this is the zenith of Jewish history, which can be a little depressing if you think about it, because we're talking about a time period, 3,000 years ago almost, and it lasts for such a short period of time. We think about the tumultuous history that we've had, and that we'll talk more about, and then we say, oh, you know what the high point was? It was 3,000 years ago when Solomon completed his temple. Now, first of all, why was it the zenith? Because the greatest amount of check marks, so to speak, were checked off at that point. In other words, what did we have as a Jewish people? We had sovereignty over the land of Israel. We had, as we'll see, undisputed sovereignty. Solomon didn't really fight any wars. I don't think he fought any wars during his 40 years of rule. We had the Beis Hamikdash. We had the temple. We had a king who was righteous for the most part, King Solomon. We had the Jewish people, for the most part, united. And all of these things we never had again in history from this point forward. This is the one time in history we can look at and say, we almost had it, right? We had the land, we had the king, we had the people, we had the peace, we had the building. Like, we were so close, but we're going to see that it doesn't quite happen. And why doesn't it happen? And the reason that it seems to all fall apart or all start to unravel has to do with a mistaken calculation of King Solomon. Now, when we mentioned before the distinction or the breakdown of Solomon's life, we said 4 years were great, 36 years, not so great. So what happened in year 5 to make the next 36 years of his reign in question and not so great? The prophet tells us that he marries Bas Pharaoh. He marries the daughter of Pharaoh. And we gave a class specifically on this a number of months ago. Now, this is not to be confused with the Queen of Sheba. She's going to come along later. That's a totally different lady. And it's not even clear. He probably did not even, he for sure didn't marry the Queen of Sheba. And it's only, according to one opinion, that he even had a child with the Queen of Sheba. But that's going to come a little bit later. This is before that. This is the daughter of Pharaoh from Egypt. And Solomon takes her as a wife. Now, what was the problem with that? The problem is not that in and of itself, but it is what it led to. It set forward a process that Solomon tried to work on and tried to put forward that we're going to see ultimately was his demise. And what was that? Solomon has strategy. His strategy was he was going to go to all of the world powers at that time, and really every nation at the time was his goal. And he was going to make the ultimate treaty with every nation of the world. Now, in antiquity, how were treaties ratified or certified or consummated, so to speak? They were done so in marriage. And we see this up until almost modern times, that we see nations are brought together through marriage. There are two kings that will make a treaty together. They'll marry off their children, and that way solidifying the kingdom as one big kingdom. And that essentially is what Solomon was trying to do. His plan was to marry the daughter of every king of every nation, have a child, and therefore he would have his son as the king of every single nation, therefore uniting the whole entire world, tachas kanfei Shechina, underneath God's presence, and so to speak, bringing on what we now refer to as the Messianic era through the unity of the world, through the united recognition of the Almighty, through the united celebration of the oneness of God. That's what he was trying to do. And this really goes hand in hand with a Kabbalistic concept that helps us really to define our exile in general, that Kabbalah teaches that when the Almighty created the world, he had to be mitzamtzem himself. He had to reduce himself to be able to bring a piece of him into physical presence that we know as this world. And when that happened, his holiness, so to speak, exploded is the best way to explain it. And sparks of his holiness, what we call nitzotzos hakadusha, were dropped all over this planet. And the Arizal teaches that until all of those sparks of holiness are released, the final redemption, the Messianic era, cannot arrive. Now, this is a great perspective to have in mind when we talk about the trials and travails and the exile of the Jewish people throughout the whole world. And in Messianic terms, we can say that we had to go over the whole entire world to unlock all of these sparks of holiness. And once the sparks are unlocked, then the Messianic era can come. That's what Solomon was trying to do. He figured that if every nation would, so to speak, become a Jewish nation, then that would hasten the kingdom of God on earth. We would bring about the days that we talk about of Biyomahu Yeh Hashem Echad U'Shmo Echad, that the day will come when the Lord will be one and his name one. And that's how Solomon was trying to do it. Now, on paper, it seems like a great strategy. There's only one problem. God said no, right? So Solomon, this was not part of God's plan. In fact, for us, it was actually last week's Torah reading. If you were paying attention last week in Parsha Shoftim, the rough picture of what a Jewish king is supposed to look like is given, and there are warnings given. And Samuel, when he brought the monarchy to fruition, he echoed these words. And there are certain directives given to the king of Israel. And one of the directives is you shouldn't have too many wives. You shouldn't have too many wives. You shouldn't have too many wives. You shouldn't have too many horses. You shouldn't have too much money. You shouldn't have too many possessions. You shouldn't have too much gashmias, as we call it, too much physicality. Now, a wife isn't physicality. I'm not meaning to make that link, but the idea was that the Almighty and his directive for a king was anticipating Solomon's plan. That there could be these political marriages and they could come to an abundance, and that could lead to problems. And in fact, for Solomon, it does. And we're going to see that now, of course, the Talmud tells us clearly that these ladies all converted before they married Solomon. They did go through some sort of conversion, but we're going to see the conversion was often not sincere, and therefore their native gods are brought into the land of Israel. And we're going to see that even though David, really Saul, we'll go further than that, Samuel, Saul, David, Solomon beginning of Solomon's career, worked so hard to keep the Jewish people on the straight and narrow, and they had done so for a very long time. We're going to see this process of Solomon marrying up to 1,000 wives. That is going to be the beginning of the end of the First Commonwealth, which is quite depressing because we're right at the beginning, and already, so to speak, the picture is going to be painted for the end. In fact, our sages tell us that on the day that Solomon marries the daughter of Pharaoh, Bas Pharaoh, a stick is put into the ocean, and around that stick collects the earth that eventually becomes Rome, and Rome will be the ultimate destroyer of the Jewish presence in the land of Israel, at least the second Commonwealth. And so therefore, we understand now that when Solomon marries the daughter of Pharaoh, it was against the will of the Almighty. It was a plan that the Torah said not to do. But Solomon knew he was the wisest of all people. We haven't quite talked about his wisdom yet, but we see clearly that he was the wisest of all people. So Solomon figured, you know what? That directive, that's for a normal king, but I'm Shlomo. Now, we shouldn't think that he was haughty or full of himself. He understood he had talents above and beyond the average bear, so to speak. And therefore, he was saying, I'm not going to have the problems that the Torah speaks about. Now, this actually is just a little bit of an aside, but it is a very interesting pitfall that we can get in. If we study the simple words of the Chumash, the simple words of the Torah, and even a lot of Talmudic literature and Midrashic literature, the concept of what we call Tamei HaMitzvos, which means the reasons of the commandments in the Torah, is not heavily discussed. And it's really a much later discussion, trying to piece things together to understand different commandments, why we have them. Now, some of our commandments are very obvious, what we call mishpatim, or Tort law, or logical laws that we could come to so seemingly on our own. But then we have a number of what we call chukim, the not so logic-based laws, like not mixing wool and linen, not mixing milk and meat, et cetera, et cetera. These are shaking a lulav and esrog. These are what we call chukim. And there's been a study in the past, 1,000 years or so, of trying to give reasons for all the commandments. And it's a question that I, as a rabbi, get all the time. Rabbi, why do we do this? Rabbi, why do we wear tefillin? Rabbi, why do we put up mezuzahs? Rabbi, why do we do this? Why do we do that? And the answers are called the Tamei HaMitzvos, which does not translate as the reasons for the mitzvos. It's the taste of the mitzvah. Meaning, of course, the Almighty in his divine wisdom, there's a reason for every commandment we have. We're given a little taste of that reason, but we don't always have the full reason. And part of that calculation is that if we had the full reason, then we'd start to make our own, what we call in Hebrew, cheshbonos, our own accounting on if it applies to us or it doesn't apply to us. Like one of the famous, really ludicrous examples of this is there's a canard that is often mentioned, that the whole prohibition of eating chazer, is because if you don't prepare pig properly, it can lead to a disease called trichinosis. In other words, if pig isn't cooked to the right temperature, it can lead to a trichinosis, which is a very deadly disease. So there are certain ridiculous statements saying, oh, well, that's why the Torah commanded not to eat pig. But today, where we know how to cook pig properly, we can eat pig because we're not going to have any problems with trichinosis. Ridiculous, right? Totally 100% stupid. That's the only word I can use for it. It's stupid. But, hypothetically, if that was one of the, not reasons, but tastes, and we understood that taste as to be more than just a taste, right? It's not the whole reason, it's just a taste of the reason, then it could lead us to make such mistakes, saying, oh, doesn't apply to me. I'm better than that. And at some level, that is what Solomon did. He thought he understood, and we're told that Solomon basically did understand the whole entire Torah, save the red heifer, the purification process, the red heifer, but everything else he understood. But here he made a mistake. He obviously didn't clearly understand it, and it really, in many ways, we're going to see, led to his demise, led to his downfall. Okay, I'm going to pause now to see if we have any questions at this point. Let me take a quick look in the chat box. Okay, no question in the chat box. So I'm either being crystal clear for all of you or I've bored you all to sleep. I'm not sure which one. And since everyone has their camera off, I'm going to just assume everyone's asleep. So I'll keep going for the cameras. But if you do have any questions, please feel free to put it into the chat box or just save it till the end of tonight's talk. Okay. So we're given an interesting story that depicts the beginning of, so to speak, the daughter of Pharaoh's influence on Solomon, and how it's really the beginning of the end of his rule and the problems it's going to lead to. And that is that she brings a certain type of architecture, if you will, into the palace, where she paints some sort of almost like a mural on the ceiling, as it's described, that makes it impossible for Solomon. It disorients Solomon to know whether it's day or night, because it's so realistic that it looks like a night that even when the sun rises in the morning, Shlomo still thinks it's nighttime. And because of this, one day, Shlomo, after marrying the daughter of Pharaoh, was late for the minyan. He was late for the morning offerings. Now, interestingly, who is the one who chastises Solomon when he is late because of his new wife? It is a man by the name of Yeravam ben Nevat. Now, who was Yeravam ben Nevat? Yeravam ben Nevat, in my humble opinion, is one of the most tragic characters in the whole entire Torah, in the whole entire Tanakh, in the whole entire Bible. And there's many tragic characters, but he is one of the most tragic characters. Because at this point in the game, we're told he is a great person. He's a Talmud Chacham. He's a Torah scholar. He's a righteous Jew. He's a wonderful person. So much so that he's the one who calls out Solomon for coming late. And it seems to be okay, even though usually you can't really call it the king like that. But it seems that he's the one who's fitting to do that. And this is our introduction to someone who starts off great, but unfortunately is going to have an absolutely terrible demise. So much so that in the end of the story, the Talmud is going to tell us that he is one of the few leaders of the Jewish people who doesn't even have a portion in the world to come. That's how bad he ends up. So he starts off so great and ends off so bad. And we'll see why momentarily. Okay, so over the next 36 years, the temple's functioning, but Solomon is declining in certain ways because he's marrying these women, and it's bringing a foreign influence into the country. And eventually the Almighty chastises him. He says, Shlomo, you messed up. You married this foreman. Now the way it's written by the prophet, by the way, is it seems to accuse Shlomo of worshiping idols. Now, that does not fit with many other things that the prophet says, that the book of Chronicles says, that the Talmud says. It doesn't fit. So what's the chastisement? Because there is the concept of the Jewish people being guarantors for one another, and the whole idea of what we call in Hebrew misayeya, that if somebody does a transgression, that the responsibility of that in large part goes onto ourselves. This is one of the famous transgressions in the Torah of lifnei iver lo sitein michshol, that we're not supposed to put a stumbling block before the blind. That means both physically, a stumbling block before the physically blind, and also metaphysically for tripping people up spiritually, we're not supposed to do. So Solomon himself never worshipped idols, safe to say. But because he went through this process of marrying these 1,000 women, many of which did not stick to Judaism and many of which brought foreign influences into the country, the idol worship that ends up in the country is ultimately blamed on Solomon. And the Almighty says, you're done. I'm going to rip the kingdom away from you, and we're going to give it to somebody else. But because you have that big bank account that we spoke about before, that you built the temple, that you start off great, that you're David's son, all these things, it's not going to happen until after you die. But after you die, after you pass away, your kingdom is not going to last. We're going to rip it away from you. What does that mean? Because it's very interesting as we see what plays out. What is going to happen is that after Shlomo passes away, the Jewish kingdom is going to split into two kingdoms. We're going to have essentially the whole Jewish people are going to leave Solomon's son, whose name is Rechavam. So our two characters are going to be Rechavam and Yeravam. The whole Jewish people are going to leave Rechavam and form their own country. Now, we ought to refer to these countries as the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, because if you look at the geography of Israel, the whole northern part of the country, essentially from Jerusalem north, becomes the land of the new country, so to speak, or the broken away country, the seceded country. And everything south of that is going to be left for the house of David. Now, that might say, okay, it looks like an even split. If we look at it, area-wise, it looks like a pretty even split. But if we know anything about the climate land of Israel, it's not an even split, because as we know, everything north of Jerusalem is inhabitable and everything south of Jerusalem is desert for the most part. Nowadays, we have areas that are inhabitable because of modern technology. But in antiquity, much of that area was not inhabitable, it was desert. And therefore, Solomon's son, Rechavam, is left with very little. And the name of the two countries become, well, if the majority broke away, they kept the name, right? Majority rules, and they're still called Yisrael. They're still called Israel. And all that's left is the tribe of Judah. The tribe of Judah sticks with the house of David, with Rechavam, and their country, so to speak, becomes known as Yehuda. Now, it's not just Yehuda. We understand that 10 tribes went with Yeravam to form the northern kingdom, and 2 stuck by Rechavam. That Judah and Benjamin stick with Rechavam. Now, if we look at a map, and I should have had one handy, I think a few weeks ago we gave a map, maybe I'll find one for the end, about how the land was divided at the time of Joshua. Actually, I know exactly where it is. I have it on the website. So let me bring that up while I'm going. But if we look at how the land was divided at the time of Joshua, we see something very interesting for how things end up splitting. And that is that we understand that 10 out of 12 of the tribes seem to be north and Judah and Benjamin are south. So it seems to work out. But there's one geographic issue, and that is that there's a third tribe that is also in the south, besides just Judah and Benjamin, and that is the tribe of Dan. The tribe of Dan is also in the southern part of the country. And so therefore, there's a lot of discussion as to what the tribe of Dan did. Did they go with Rechavam in the south? Did they go with Yeravam in the north and abandon their land? What exactly happened? Different opinions in our sages, not too clear. But in general, when we talk about the 10 tribes, or now we call them the 10 lost tribes. Oh, here we go. Here's a great picture. Found it on the website. Let me bring it up for you here. I'm sorry, I said Dan. I meant Shimon. I meant Simon. Dan did go to the north. I meant Simon. So we see here that this whole area. Let me get my pointer thing here. Here we go. So this whole area becomes what we call the northern kingdom, or Yisrael, and simply this part here is what remains Judah, because it's the land of Judah. Now, again, even though it looks like a lot of land, it's almost all desert. So like I said, Simon, it's a debate whether they were loyal to the north, loyal to the south. Be it as it may, we do count them amongst the 10 tribes that left the house of David, that left Rechavam. And so now what's interesting is that even though this is already, so to speak, spelled out to Solomon in his life, he's told that it's going to happen. And this is very much in the theme of Elul. And by the way, if you haven't signed up for the Elul challenge, be sure to sign up now. And if you haven't participated in Elul talks, we have all kinds of great Elul programming going on. We'll touch it on the end, but very much in theme of Elul, Rosh Hashanah, of growth. That even when there's a divine decree, right? We say this in Nisan Tokef, the famous prayer Nisan Tokef. We say Usashuva, Usafila, Utsadaka, Mavirin Esra Hagazera. That Shuva, coming back to Hashem, Tefillah, prayer, Tzedakah, giving charity, can uproot the most difficult decree. So even though, yes, there was a decree that the kingdom was to split after the days of Solomon, until it happens is not set in stone, because Solomon could have done the tshuva, his son Rechavam could have done the tshuva, and could have, so to speak, rectified the matter, but they don't. Okay, let's just wrap up on, I wanted to say one more thing on Shlomo and King Solomon, and then we'll jump into Rechavam to wrap up our class for tonight. So one of the great gifts that Solomon gave is that, like we said, he's known for being one of the wisest of people, and he wrote he wrote three of the wisest of the books that are canonized in our Tanakh. Those three books are Koheles, Ecclesiastes, right? That's the same book. In Hebrew, we call it Koheles. In English, we call it, or Latin, we call it Ecclesiastes. Mishle, which we refer to as Proverbs, and Shir HaShirim, the Song of Songs. All three of these were penned by King Solomon, and there's a debate in the Talmud as to when in his life he wrote each one, which one came first, what came second, what came at the end of his life. Many are of the opinion that Ecclesiastes, Koheles, came at the end of his life, and that was a description, sort of his trying to do tshuva for having married all these women and his plan failing. It seems to be alluded to in there. You can possibly say the same thing about Mishle, and then Song of Songs tells about the undying love relationship between God and the Jewish people. So these are the three books that Solomon has given to the Jewish people. Koheles is read on the holiday of Sukkot. Shir HaShirim is read on the holiday of Pesach, and Proverbs is studied. Right? It's never read. It's never read orally. It's part of the writings, and the writings, with the exception of the 5 Megillas, are never read publicly in the synagogue. So that's where Mishle falls. Okay. So Solomon dies at the young age of 52, and after he dies, that's when the decree is about to play out, that the split kingdom. Now, Rechavam has, I guess, a last-ditch effort to save the union. Right? I'm actually right now in the middle of a very interesting biography on Frederick Douglass, and it's highly recommended. I'll put the link in here afterwards. But I'm always, I guess as a Southerner, and especially in light of a lot of the racial tensions that are going on in the world today, I've been doing a lot of reading on the Civil War lately, and it's just a fascinating, sad, crazy time period in American history, but it didn't happen in a vacuum. It wasn't like in 1961 after Lincoln was elected that the union splits. No, it was coming about literally since 1776. It was a 90-year-old issue that just came to its fruition with the election of Lincoln, and that is what led to the split of the union. Because hey, that's what happens when you elect a Republican, right? The whole union falls apart. Now, I'm just kidding. Not a political statement. It was a joke. Okay, don't be careful. I have to be careful with my political jokes, but be it as it may, that was what was actually going on at the time after Solomon passed away. Is already there was the murmurs of the kingdom splitting, of the union of the Jewish people not sticking together, and Rechavam seems to have one last chance to pull it together, and that is that the prophet tells us that he takes advice from two sets of advisors. From his father's advisors, who are the elders of the Jewish people, and from his friends, his own cabinet, so to speak. And the elders say, and they ask one question. He says, how should I rule the Jewish people? The elders say, you have to go easy on them. They've had a rough time lately. It's been rough. This whole building project that your grandfather started with a temple, it took a lot of money, a lot of work, and go easy on the people. They need a king that's going to go easy on them. That's what the elders said. The youngins, his own personal committee, his own personal group of confidence, they said, show who you are, man. You're the king now. Show your strength, assert your power, and show them who's boss. Rechavam made the ill-fated error of listening to his young friends and says to the Jewish people that my father whipped you with whips of chains. I'm going to whip you with scorpions to signify like I'm going to show you who's man over here. And at that point, that was the final blow. And the Jewish people said, if that's how you're going to treat us, we out of here, right? We're done. And they split away and they form a new government, the Northern Kingdom. Now, by the way, this was completely sanctioned by the Almighty. In fact, the first king of the Northern Kingdom, Yerovam ben Nevat, is anointed by the prophet. Achia Shaloni, the prophet of the time, anoints Yerovam to be king. So this is completely authorized by the Almighty. There's nothing seditious here. There's nothing nefarious here. This is the plan. And we know it's the plan because Solomon was already told it was going to happen. Rechavam knew there's a good chance it was going to happen. And the prophet just plays it out when it's clear that Rechavam is not going to turn things around. Then the kingdom splits and it is sanctioned by the Almighty. Now, just 2 points on this. Number one is Yerovam knew clearly that even though he was anointed as king of the new kingdom, he knew it was not going to be an eternal job for his family. He knew that it was temporary. In fact, our sages tell us that the initial plan sanctioned by the Almighty of the split was supposed to happen for 36 years. Now, why 36? Because that's how long Solomon had his plan of marrying these 1,000 wives in progress, right? He married the daughter of Pharaoh in his 5th year as king. And for the next 36 years is when he was married to these 1,000 women. So therefore, the penalty of having the kingdom ripped away from him is not an eternal penalty. It's a 36-year penalty. So the idea, as our sages explain it, is that Yeravam would be, or Yeravam and Yeravam family would be the king for 36 years in the northern kingdom. And then after that period, the kingdoms would reunite once again, that hopefully by that point, the house of David would have learned what it needed to learn, and it would once again be one happy union, and reconstruction would happen. Now we're going to see next week. It doesn't play out like that, but that was Yeravam's understanding. And remember, the great tragic character that Yeravam was, he seems to understand this. He seems to be okay with it, and there's no problem. Now, it also seems that he would have had some sort of secondary role, like a vice king, like the viceroy position would have stuck with the house of Yeravam after that point. But there's the old adage of power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely, and we're going to see that is exactly what happens with Yeravam ben Nevat. Before we get to Yeravam, one more word on Rechavam down in the south, who we know very little about. It's always fascinating to me that he's really blamed with sealing the fate of the Jewish people with the split kingdom. But all we really know about him is the story that I told you, and I always found it fascinating that David had 18 wives, had many fewer sons than his son Solomon, who had at least 1,000 sons, if not more, probably more. But with David, like half of the saga of David is the succession of leadership, right? We have the whole struggle of Shalom. We had Adoniah and Solomon. Like it's a whole struggle almost throughout the whole life of David as to who is going to succeed him and what the process is and the whole thing. And then like when Solomon dies, with many more sons vying for the throne, it's just, Rechavam the king. And sages don't say anything. The prophet don't say anything. It's just not discussed. And that's always baffled me. I've never had a good answer or explanation as to that. And not only that, but Rechavam is a child on his mother's side by one of the converted princesses. Now, we're told his wife was his mother was a righteous one, not one of the ones who brought idols into the country. But like out of those 1,000 wives, there's probably a Jewish one in there. And it's also in Jewish law, it's not so clear if a king can even marry a convert to begin with. So that might have even been a problem that Solomon was doing to begin with. And yet the Davidic rule will pass on to the Midian prince, if you will, Rechavam. So that's just a fascinating thing. And one last thing on Rechavam is that with the story we told before, we see something very interesting, is that a person's personal associations or advisory committee or surrogates, confidants, whatever term you want to use, is very important. Look, my wife said I'm not allowed to talk about the Ohio 11 congressional race anymore, but this came up a lot in the race, and talking about one of the candidates' associations, her close friends, her confidants, the people that she had spent a lot of time around and had worked with and were endorsed by, etc. And if that is a taint in politics or not. We see from Rechavam, it's very much a taint, because here it was his inner circle that led him astray by giving him bad advice and led to the eventual or present split of the Jewish people at that time. Okay, so that's what happened. So in the year 797, before the Common Era, the kingdom splits into two. 10 tribes go north, form the kingdom of Israel. 2 tribes go south and keep the name of Yehuda, of the tribe of Judah. Now, the kingdom in the north is going to last for a total of 241 years. All bad years. We're going to see that every single one of the 19 kings of the northern kingdom are terrible. One's worse than the next. Okay, some are slightly better, but all are regarded as evil kings. The southern kingdom is going to last for a total of 374 years. And it's going to be very checkerboard, very black and white. The some are going to be good, some are going to be bad. And it's going to be this interesting process we're going to see is a son will inevitably almost always undo the work of his father. Meaning, if the father was righteous, the son will be wicked. If the son was wicked, if the father was wicked, the son will be righteous. And we're going to see that the son is either cleaning up for the wickedness of his father or undoing the righteousness of his father. And that's going to be the trend of the southern kingdom of Judah. And that's why they really last for 130 more years, because they have many more high moments than the northern kingdom that we're going to see has nothing but negativity for 241 years. And it starts right at the beginning. And with this story, we'll wrap up tonight's session. What happens at the beginning? So Yeravam, the tragic character, seems to be in line, anointed with the prophet, understands what the Almighty has in store for him. 36 years, I'm going to rule. Then we reunite. Got it. No problem. But there was a problem. And that is that one major city was not in his kingdom. One major city, in fact, if I can say, the most major city in the whole Jewish people was nowhere to be found in his kingdom. And of course, I'm referring to none other than Jerusalem, right? The holy city of Jerusalem. If we go back to our map over here, we have the southern kingdom down here, right? Benjamin and Judah is the southern kingdom, and Jerusalem's right. Whoops, sorry. Some funky with my, I was trying to do this, I think. Oh, forget it, I can't find the right tool I'm looking for. Anyhow, the Jerusalem's right here, right on the border of Benjamin, Judah, right in the southern kingdom. And that we're gonna see poses a very serious problem for Yeravam. What's the problem? Even though the kingdom is split, it's still a Jewish kingdom. And even though they live in the northern part of the country, there is still an obligation of every Jewish male thrice a year to come to Jerusalem. Why do we call Pesach, Shavuos, and Sukkot the pilgrimage festivals? Because we're supposed to have a pilgrimage, meaning if we don't live in Jerusalem, we're supposed to go to Jerusalem. And so whether Jews lived in the area of the north, the south, the east, and the west, no matter where they lived, or later in the Second Temple, they lived in exile, there was still an obligation to come to Jerusalem for the three pilgrimage festivals. Now that posed a very serious problem for Yeravam. Not necessarily that the Jews would all go to Jerusalem, and if the Jews would all go to Jerusalem, of course he would have to go too, because he was their king. But when the service would go on in the Holy Temple, who performed the service in the temple? It was the Kohanim, the priests. Where was everybody else? In the area called the Azara, which was the outer courtyard area of the temple, and that's where they would, so to speak, watch the service from that point. Now, what physical position would the Jewish people be in when they were standing in that courtyard? They would all be standing. There were no pews, there were no chairs, there were no beach blankets. Everyone would stand in the Azara. And our sages tell us, Ein Yeshiva B'Azara, that people weren't allowed to sit in the Azara. It was against Jewish law. Ella Malchus Beis David Bilvad, that the only person who was allowed to sit in the courtyard was the king from the house of David. And that posed a problem for Yeravam, because he sat back and he said, 1 second, if the people go to Jerusalem, I have to go to Jerusalem. And if I go to Jerusalem, I'm going to be standing there in the courtyard, and I'm going to be standing up looking like our average Joe, and there's going to be Rechavam, the son of Solomon, sitting on the throne. I can't have that. It will not be good for my power. It will look bad for me. And again, there we see the absolute power corrupting absolutely. We see the power going to his head. We see his haughtiness taking him over. And at this point, he says, I can't let the Jewish people go. I'm going to make a law. They cannot go for the pilgrimage festivals. They cannot go for what we call Aliyah L'Regel, the pilgrimage festivals, for Pesach, Shavuos, and Sukkot to Jerusalem. I'm not going to let it happen. And to do that, he actually makes the first Berlin Wall. He puts sentries on the roads to Jerusalem, and by penalty of death, the Jews from the north are not allowed to visit Jerusalem. But he says, it's okay, because I'm going to make a concession. Yeah, so they have the Temple of Solomon down there. I'm going to make you your own temple. And then I'm going to make you two temples. I'm going to make you one in the southern part of the northern kingdom and one in the northern part of the northern kingdom for your convenience. You won't have to go to one place, and you can come to these temples to worship. And what does he put in those temples? No, he does not design them like the Beis Hamikdash, like the Holy Temple. He puts in each one of those temples a golden calf. Now, the way I'm describing Yeravam is he was a great scholar. He was a righteous Jew. Like, don't you think he learned a little bit of Chumash? Like, don't you think he learned the story of the golden calf? Wouldn't he know better? Like the Jews kind of like messed up with the golden calf pretty bad at one point in history. Why in the world would he choose a golden calf? And two of them nonetheless. The answer is, and this comes loosely, we might even talked about this before, I don't recall, but the way that Nachmanides explains the golden calf is he says that the golden calf, the concept of the golden calf was really if it had been physically right for the Jews to make such a focal point at that point in time, the right focal point would have been the golden calf. But it wasn't the right thing to do, and it was a terrible thing to do, but had it been the right time, that would have been the right item. Why? Because the golden calf represents the left side of the Almighty's chariot, which is, so to speak, the weaker side of his chariot. The lion's the strong side. The calf is the weak side. And it was a way of saying, if we can't go to Jerusalem, which is the strong side, we are going to go to the golden calves, which are the weak side. Be it as it may, terrible grave error. And through building these temples with the golden calves, he essentially introduces idol worship into the northern kingdom, never to cease throughout its whole time as a kingdom, never to cease throughout its 241 years. And with that, he's going to seal his own demise. The prophet is going to his own son is going to become sick and die. His whole house is going to be wiped out. It's going to be a terrible ending for Yeravam, so much so that, as we said before, he's not even going to have a place in the world to come. And this really sets the trend, unfortunately, for the whole history of the Northern Kingdom, as we're going to talk about in our next few sessions. Now, for the next few sessions, it's going to be the first of really the rest of Jewish history that we're going to have to do this, that it's going to be a 7-10 geographical split, because now we have two kingdoms. We have two different geographical areas that we're going to have to address as we tell the history of the Jewish people. Now, in conclusion, I want to just point out that until now, everything we've been saying for the most part has been coming from one source, from first the Torah, then the book of Joshua, then the book of Judges, then the book of Samuel. Now we are going to see that split into also a two-stage event. And that is that we now have two different histories or records of this time period. When David dies and Solomon takes over, that begins what we call the Book of Kings. Now, even though based on the Septuagint and the Christian Bible, it's broken into two books, and the Jewish counting is only one book. There's only one book of Kings, one book of Samuel. It's all one book. But we have the Book of Kings, which describes both the history of the northern and the southern kingdom, the histories of the kingdom of Israel and the kingdom of Judah. And they're both described in the Book of Kings. But we also have a book called Divrei Hayamim, or Chronicles. Now, Chronicles is just the chronicles of the southern kingdom, of the house of Judah. And it basically only tells the story of the southern kingdom, except for when there are interactions between the northern and southern kingdom. We'll talk about a little bit later why we have two accounts in the Tanakh of this time period. But quite simply, I'll say it simply now, and we'll maybe go more into in depth later. So the Book of Kings is written by the prophet Jeremiah. The Book of Chronicles is written by Ezra at the beginning of the Second Commonwealth. Jeremiah is towards the end of the First Commonwealth. So Jeremiah writes the Book of Kings, and Ezra, when the Jews come back to Israel after 7 years, writes the Book of Chronicles. Now, we understand that the main reason Ezra writes Chronicles is because that was supposed to be, so to speak, the platform for a man by the name of Zerubbabel, who was the heir apparent of the Jewish people, to be able to reinstitute the Davidic monarchy. In other words, he was the descendant of the house of David. It seemed that he was going to be the one in the second temple that should be king. And therefore, when Ezra writes Chronicles, he's writing the whole history to pave the way for Zerubbabel to take the throne. As we'll see, it never happens. Now, there are different discrepancies between Ezra's account and Jeremiah's account, and we'll hit on some of those as we go. But that's the simple explanation as to why we have these two accountings as to this time period and what's going on. Now, as we go a little bit further, closer to the end of, or the middle, I should say, of the of this time period, we're going to have more than two. I'm sitting here talking and I realize I'm muted. None of you caught any of that. I apologize. If any of you are even still on, my phone on my phone here. But we were basically done. That the kingdom splits. We got two books telling us a story, and we'll continue next week with the story of the split kingdom. I want to thank you all for coming. Thank you for listening, and feel free to unmute yourself or put something in the chat box if you have any questions at this point. Okay, so with no further ado, we'll wish you all a good evening, and we will see you all next week. Thank you all for coming.